Hi everyone, this is Shane O'Grady from accountancyschool.ie and welcome to this presentation on Porter's Diamond. Now, Porter's Diamond is undoubtedly one of the more peripheral topics on the P3 syllabus. It has only been asked 3 times in 21 exams. However, in the second most recent question, it was in question 1. Therefore, there was also obviously a disproportionate amount of negative repercussions if you didn't perform well in this question when it was in the compulsory part of the paper. Okay, so this presentation aims to introduce the topic as per the syllabus. I'll then go on to explain the theory and hopefully illustrate that with some examples that will be memorable, so therefore it can reduce the amount of private study time that you have to allocate to the topic. I'm going to review the 3 questions to date, focusing on the marking scheme as part of the exam technique, and then prepare you for a short Porter's Diamond question that I do on the revision course. Okay, so the syllabus is pretty straightforward. Explore, using Porter's Diamond, the influence of national competitiveness on the strategic position of an organisation. So that doesn't really give an awful lot of clarity as to what this model addresses, and explored is obviously quite a broad verb. So let's get into the detail of it and see if we can throw some light. Okay, so Porter's Diamond is made up of these 4 components. It was one of the first academic models produced by the famous Professor Michael Porter from Harvard Business School. I personally think it's an incredibly interesting model. Now, that isn't often something that carries an awful lot of currency when you're preparing for these professional exams, but I think it can be quite interesting to, explore why is it that Japan as a country seems to completely dominate the consumer electronics industry. So when you think of, let's say, the top 10 consumer electronics company in the world, you're probably going to find that Japan has 5, 6 or 7 of those. Now, recently, South Korea has started making some inroads in that industry, and again, Porter's Diamond would help to explain that. The United States, the one that would obviously spring to mind would be obviously in the whole area of IT. And when you think of the power of, let's say, the United States' biggest rival in every other sphere, both as an economic power, political influence, as a military superpower, China is still nowhere near the USA's domination of that industry. When you think of Facebook, Google, Twitter, Yahoo, Dell, Hewlett-Packard, Oracle, Microsoft, it just goes on and on, so they're completely dominating that industry and they seem to have this kind of national competitive advantage. So Porter goes through that and tries to put some kind of logic on it. Germany, we're going to pick the premium car industry. That's the one that I'm actually going to go through in this presentation. I personally find that one very interesting. And then I suppose, in France, you could pick maybe a number, but the one that I think would be maybe most obvious would be maybe, wine and champagne. There are other countries that have a very kind of a similar climate, etc. So it can't just be that factor on its own. Why does France dominate that industry? And the top vineyards, the top wine and champagne producers, most of them all seem to come from that country. So Porter basically challenged this notion that that just happens, that national competitive advantage is just something that is kind of gifted to a country. It's part of their cultural DNA. It's in the genes. We even have a kind of a strange Irish expression about this. We'd say, there's something in the water. So, there's some minerals or some nutrients in the water in that local region, and that gives these people special powers to dominate a certain industry. Now, that just makes absolutely no logical, empirical sense. So Porter decided to explore this and he came up with this model. Now, the first thing to watch out for is, even though it's a diamond and the diamond is made up of 4 points, I would suggest to you that there's actually 5 components, because the factor conditions, which is the first one we're examining, are split into 2. So what we have is what we call basic factors and advanced factors. Basic factors, I would suggest to you, if it's not too improper, let's use the term God-given. These are things that, yes, might be just, good old-fashioned luck. You know, the land you've been given is very fertile, or you've been given land with an awful lot of minerals, you've been given land in a very good location. You know, there is some sort of a thing that has been gifted to you. And then on top of that, then maybe the climate, and the climate, you know, can help you. Now, one thing to also watch out for here, it's not necessarily that the land is always a positive thing, it's that the land drives a positive outcome. So the scarcity of land and good stable land to build on has been a major factor in driving the success of the consumer electronics companies within Japan, because they have had to focus very much on compactness and miniaturization, etc. So it's actually the fact that they have bad land that has kind of driven them to succeed in a certain area. Similarly, when you think of, you know, some of the very, very successful Scandinavian outdoor clothing and mountaineering companies, the reason that they are very successful is obviously because they have, you know, tough land. They have, you know, very cold ice, snow conditions to deal with, and that then basically drives them to produce a very good product. But in most cases, it's that the land, the natural resources, and the climate in that particular country or region happens to be very beneficial and positive for the industry that you're looking at, and saying, why does it happen that so many of the top companies in that industry all happen to be based in that country or region? The second part of factor conditions then are advanced factors, and these are more what we have to, you know, we have to manufacture. They're not, you know, basic factors that are God-given, again, pardon that expression. So we're talking about skills and knowledge, which, you know, very often the government is involved in this. You know, so do you have a highly educated workforce? Are they very much into having a second language? Do they focus much on maybe technological skills, elements like this? And then how technologically advanced is the country? You know, is everybody kind of pulling together and trying to make sure, you know, that it has the best kind of IT infrastructure out there? And then there's other infrastructural issues again, like ports, airports, road, rail, all these types of things. So, you know, that gives you kind of a very, very good foundation in a country or a region if you have very good basic factors and advanced factors. Okay, so let's move around. Then maybe we'll go to the next one, will be related and supporting industries. Now, in the context of related and supporting industries, some obvious examples there, we go back to the United States. Even more so now is a huge industry that happens to support the IT industry in the United States is the weapons, or, you know, what they often call the military industrial complex. So the weapons industry, again, some of the top weapons manufacturers in the world are all based in the United States. I think the United States spends more money on defense as a country than the next top 9 countries combined. So, you know, that's kind of incredible when you think about it. And that means that, you know, the United States spends more money on defense than China, plus Russia, plus all the rest of NATO, plus India, plus Pakistan. Add all those countries up together, and America still spends more than all of them together. And that means there are massive projects, there are massive research and development grants given to IT companies in the United States in order to see if they can develop systems and technology that, you know, has maybe at the outset a very, very good use for the military, but then can obviously be adopted in the civilian sector. You know, the space race produced many things like Teflon and the microwave, etc. In more recent time, you know, GPS, something that we all take for granted now, and we may imagine or assume it was designed for civilians and for commercial uses from the outset. Wasn't. It was designed for, you know, unfortunately, a much kind of a darker military purpose, which was, you know, first of all, to aid with navigation in deserts where there aren't landmarks, but also for the targeting of weapon systems, you know, that you could accurately target your weapons at certain locations by using this very accurate technology. So related and supporting industries are other industries within the country or region which happen to complement and happen to make the industry that you might be looking at even more successful. So there is this kind of, you know, hand and glove approach with both of those. Moving along then to demand conditions. Thankfully, this is one of the ones that is nearly the easiest to explain. And the idea here is think of D for demand and think of D for domestic. So the idea would be is that in the country or region in which you are looking at this industry where this country or region seems to have most of the top companies globally in that industry happen to be just located in this region. It's mainly, or another reason why it might happen is because the local consumers in that country or region have incredibly high demand expectations. The standards that they require from the local domestic company is of such a high standard that when those companies in that country or region decide to export globally, the consumers then in the global market are just blown away with the standard of the product. So this is something, not one of the examples we're going to look at here, but very briefly, it's why, Italy will probably always continue to dominate men's fashion. Now, Italy is quite strong in women's fashion, but so would France and maybe some other countries as well. But like, why do the Italians, when you think of it, Armani, Gucci, Pravda, Dolce and Gabbana, Versace, why are all those companies Italian? And one of the reasons for it is that there is a big cultural thing in Italy of men being very fashion conscious. Now, men would like to think that all men, regardless of nationality, are fashion conscious, but if any of you have spent any time in Italy, the Italians are especially fashion conscious. And therefore, if you are an Italian male consumer and you maybe want to patriotically support your own indigenous fashion industry, the expectations that you have of the quality and then the trend and various developments that might be happening with fabrics and colors, etc., they're incredibly high expectations. So by the time Armani or Gucci or Dolce & Gabbana or Pravda or Versace is able to produce a certain season of clothes that will be acceptable to male Italian customers, that standard is going to be an incredibly high standard. And when you start then putting those garments on clothing racks in clothing stores in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in America, in Canada, those consumers are going to come in, and when they look at the British, the Irish, the Canadian or the American competition, there just is no competition. The standard of the Italian garments are so high. Why? Driven by the incredibly demanding expectations of the local consumers. Now, the last part of the diamond, it does have three components to it, but I wouldn't split it down as much as factor conditions, which have two very, very definite separate components, basic factors and advanced factors. So this is the whole thing of firm, strategy, structure, and rivalry. And the idea here is that, sometimes when you look at this particular country or region that you examine and you say to yourself, why is there an industry in that region where, when you look at, the top 5 domestic companies in that region, those top 5 also happen to be the top 5 globally? Well, sometimes that can be is because, there has been a kind of almost a cultural decision that the firm will adopt a particular strategy. Now, that could be, let's say, in the United States with the tech companies, it's aggression and it's almost bravery and it's very, very risk-seeking, etc. Like, if any of you have seen the movie The Social Network, now we know it's a dramatization, but if it in any way reflects the truth, you can see that, Mark Zuckerberg was absolutely cutthroat and brutal and aggressive in the way that he wanted to develop his business. And that is kind of a thing that could be said about many of the high profile tech entrepreneurs. I don't think that Steve Jobs could be accused of being a saint, neither could Bill Gates. It is one of these things where, the strategy in Silicon Valley is survival of the fittest, it's grab market share, take no prisoners, and if there's casualties along the way, so be it. Then if you look at other countries and regions and other industries, and one that we're going to look at in this presentation would be, why have the Germans been so good at dominating the premium car industry? And that's because most of the firms that produce premium cars in Germany, one of the common denominators they have is their strategy in terms of quality. They are very much focused on producing quality, and they're not necessarily focused on margin or gouging customers for profits, etc., etc. Then we get into the whole area of structure and rivalry. Now, structure is one of the ones that is maybe sometimes the least easy to identify. One example of that, we won't have a chance to go through it in this presentation in detail, would be what has happened in South Korea in the last 20 years, very much driven by hugely powerful businessmen and by an early kind of cross-political party agreement. They decided that the way they should structure their firms was merge them together to make these 5 massively large conglomerates. So when you look at all the big successful South Korean brands, you're going to find that they basically all come from one of 5 massive conglomerates. And what they decided was the way they needed to structure themselves was scale. If they wanted to compete internationally, there was no point in having, 5 or 6 companies that produced, particularly good consumer electronics goods. They needed to have 2. And we think of maybe Samsung and we think of LG. And what they've done is basically similarly with car manufacturers. So they're taking on the Japanese very aggressively in the car manufacturing industry. And the main reason for that is rather than splitting themselves across and structuring themselves in terms of a lot of different brands and a lot of different companies, if you think of all the various Japanese car manufacturers and contrast that to the 2 main South Korean companies, which are Hyundai and Kia, it explains the way that they've structured themselves. So that sometimes can be one of the reasons why a certain country or region begins to dominate an industry because of the structural approach that has been taken. And the last one is almost kind of a chicken and egg, is the rivalry. So in the same way that locally you have very, very high demand conditions, let's go back to the Italian example, and the male fashion consumers expecting very, very high standards. That also generates then incredible rivalry amongst the local companies. So it's like in sports, you'll often talk about the fact that there's a local derby, and a local derby generates incredible rivalry when there are 2 teams from the same city or 2 provincial teams from the same country battling against each other in a sporting competition. It can be the most aggressive type of competition, and that drives very high standards, because if that's the level of competition that you're experiencing at a domestic level, it's almost then easy when you go and compete against international rivals, because the local rivalry is so bloody that you are kind of, you're battle proven at that stage, and you're really kind of a veteran of that type of a combative rivalry. And when you then go and compete internationally, you're able to thrive and able to prosper. Okay, so that's basically the introduction to it. So Porter said, look, when we look at countries and we look at industries in those countries where it seems that that country seems to offer this thing of a national competitive advantage, it's not some sort of a kind of a fluky cultural DNA in the water situation. Typically, you can break it down to these constituent components. Okay, so let's take a look at the first example here, and what we're going to do is try and just very quickly now give you a little bit more detail to make sure you clearly understand the model by taking a look at Germany and basically seeing, why does Germany appear to have a national competitive advantage in the premium car industry? So when you look at the top premium car brands in the world, why is it that Germany seems to completely dominate that list? So another way of phrasing that would be, why does Germany appear to provide the best environment for premium car companies? Kind of think of like, why does the land over there, why is that a more fertile land for me to grow a crop than the land over here? So imagine, there's kind of there's a valley, and then there's a mountain on one side, a mountain on another, country A and country B. You're in country A, and you're looking across the valley at country B, and they're growing the same crop as you. It's just that it's far more healthy. They're getting far bigger yields. It's much easier. It's less expensive. It's higher quality. Why? What's wrong with our environment, and what seems to be right with their environment? So why do those people over across the valley in country B, why do they seem to have, as a nation, a competitive advantage over us poor buggers over here on the other side of the valley in country A. So that's the kind of the idea behind it. So look, you just look at it there. Obviously, Germany has Mercedes. Mercedes has a very significant relationship with Aston Martin in terms of producing the vast majority of their engines now. BMW actually owns Rolls-Royce. Porsche and the Volkswagen Group have a very complicated relationship, but let's just consider them as separate companies for the moment. And within the Volkswagen Group, you do have some non-premium brands such as Skoda and Seat and maybe even Volkswagen itself. You then have undoubtedly some premium brands like Bentley, Bugatti, Lamborghini, and even in more recent times, I would suggest to you that many of the Audi models would be considered premium cars and part of a premium brand. So it's incredible when you consider that Germany is only a population of 80 million people. It has very, very high labour costs, and it is quite a distance away from maybe its biggest international markets. How is it dominating this list in such a significant way? Okay, so that's what we're going to try and explore. So let's take a look at the first one, which is factor conditions. So remember what I said, basic factors and advanced factors. What are the, pardon the expression, God-given things that might have given Germany an advantage in this area, and then what are the advanced factors that come to play as well. So if we take a look, basic factors and advanced factors, let's start with the basic factors. Originally, of course, Germany was the country that, produced the first car in the latter part of the 1800s. And at that time, the Alsace-Lorraine region, was very heavy in iron ore. So that was something that was kind of God-given. It just so happened that one of the key raw materials for car production happened to be sitting in the ground in Germany waiting there for them. Now, that has long been since exhausted and they have to import most of that component now, but it gave them momentum in the early days. So that's obviously where automobile, Das Auto, that's where it comes from, and they got that kind of, really good head start. Something that has obviously maintained and has not gone away is their location. They are in the center of Europe, so they are in quite a good location in that regard. And they are able to, very easily go north, where they obviously have a small coastline for shipping their products internationally. They can go then, west to France, the UK, etc. They can go east into the Russian Federation and some of the other Eastern European countries, and then they can go south, obviously, to the likes of Italy, Spain, Portugal, etc. That's all pretty easy in terms of rail and road, and then if they need to export the United States to Asia to South America, they do have the ability to get their product to the shipping ports, their own shipping ports in Germany, or more likely by road and rail to the Netherlands, and from the Netherlands on to their onward destinations. So the location gives them an advantage. Climate, the idea here is kind of twofold. Germany happens to be a very, very energy efficient country using an awful lot of wind energy, and that's something that helps with any kind of heavy industry. And also the whole idea is that they have a climate where they produce cars that suit an awful lot of customers, because Germany does experience quite hot summers, does have an awful lot of rainfall in the winter, does in fact in some parts of Germany have heavy amounts of snow. So they are producing cars which nearly kind of suit every type of consumer. So those are kind of small basic factor conditions that have given them a bit of a head start. Now, what would far outweigh those things is the advanced factor conditions. The educational policy in Germany in terms of being very, very proactive about apprenticeships. If you consider the situation in Ireland and the UK, there is almost still an element of snobbery about people who might leave school early. This is kind of the term that's used to take up an apprenticeship. And somebody who's considered like a tradesman. It's a very kind of a loaded term in Ireland and the UK. Not in Germany. It is seen as a very, very good career path, very well paid, and there wouldn't even be the view you're leaving school early. You're leaving the state, high school system early, but you're going on to a different type of education. In fact, you're continuing your education for at least 4 or 5 years later until you have gone the whole way through your apprenticeship. So that massively helps with then the people who are involved in the design, the development, and then obviously the manufacturing of their vehicles. They've only 9 state universities, incredible when you contrast that to the ridiculous situation that we have in Ireland. We have 4 million of a population, maybe rounding it up to maybe 5 million in the future. Germany has 80 million. 80 million population. They have 9 universities. If we think of it in Ireland, there might be some dispute about this because various ones, but we have, for example, NUIG in Galway, UL in Limerick, UCC in Cork. Then in Dublin we have UCD, we have Trinity, we have DCU, then we have NUI Maynooth. So that's 7. So we've 7 universities for a population of 5 million. In Germany they have 9. They have just 2 more for a population of 80 million. So the idea there is that they focus very much on economies of scale. They focus on the whole idea of centralization and specialization, and that's where they produce all these incredible engineers and people who provide so much value for their car industry. And then not only are there only 9 state universities, there is a massive STEM focus, to use that term that's become quite popular in recent years. Science, technology, engineering and maths. They would be the ultimate priority within the university system there. And again, I know it's maybe me picking a little bit of a kind of an easy target. When you contrast that to the Irish university system, where there seems to be a complete disproportionate amount of concentration on what we might call arts or the humanities, hundreds and hundreds of people doing, a Bachelor of Arts in philosophy and Greek civilization or whatever it might be. I'm not saying that that shouldn't have a place in universities, but perhaps the ratio that we have in Ireland is maybe a little bit skewed, and maybe we could maybe rebalance that a small bit. So certainly in Germany they took that policy and they produce a lot of engineering graduates, and that then helps to drive these industries. Their transport infrastructure is second to none. In one way, maybe kind of for sad reasons, their country was absolutely obliterated after the Second World War, so they had to start from scratch. So they built everything, ironing out any previous problems and, being aware of what the transport infrastructure would need to be. Whereas in maybe, let's say, take again Ireland and the UK, an awful lot of the streets were designed for horse and carriage, not for cars, not for buses, etc., etc. Their tax policy would be very, pro-business, pro-entrepreneurs, pro-innovation, and also R&D grants would very much support that as well and help companies involved in engineering and elements like that. So when you look at those factors, that kind of, foundation, that kind of bedrock, if you basically are trying to build a very successful premium car company and you're doing it in Germany, you're starting on a very, very good foundation, because the basic factors and the advanced factors in particular kind of give you that really good head start. Okay, so if we move on then to the next element where we're going to take a look at, which is related and supporting industries. Now there's maybe an element of chicken and egg here, were the related and supporting industries there first, and they're what helped to spawn and to develop the premium car companies, or is it that the premium car companies then kind of acted as a catalyst and an incentive and a stimulus for the related and supporting industries? It doesn't really matter, but the reality is that they're nearly always there. So we take a look in this scenario, look at some of these very well-known German companies. Blaupunkt, we would have been aware for years that you would have got a very high quality Blaupunkt stereo in your German car. And that was something that kind of was very notable, and that the car wasn't just functional. It was something that if you bought a BMW or you bought a Mercedes, or you bought one of these cars, you didn't have to go and buy then a third-party stereo system. The one that you got was of a very high quality. Continental, very successful tire company in its own right. So there'd be many people who would use Continental tires and swear by their quality and their reliability, who don't drive German premium cars. But again, it's a related and supporting industry which helps them in that context. Then we look at ones maybe, the likes of Bosch, who have a huge automotive engineering component, as do Rheinmetall. Siemens and Grundig, again, would produce an awful lot of maybe the more recent electronic and electrical components that would be in modern cars. And then maybe less so Krups, because we would say, well, Krups is maybe, mostly kind of, kitchenware, appliances. But again, you know, it's the skill set. You're talking about people who are engineering, problem-based type of skills. And again, you know, you might have somebody who has spent a number of years working in Krups and they suddenly end up then maybe working in the, you know, the human computer interface division of one of the premium car manufacturers in Germany, because they have very much focused on, you know, how do we make this device very user friendly for the consumer. So the same way that, you know, they might know have been doing this for years in Krups with a coffee blender or with you know, some sort of a food processor, it's not a massive transition for them then to take those forward to how do we make a steering wheel, how do we make a dashboard, you know, how do we make the various switches and knobs for the air conditioning and the sunroof, how do we make those as user friendly as possible for people who buy a BMW or buy a Mercedes or whatever. And then lastly, even though we've mentioned it previously, you know, very much helped by the government and helped by kind of government policy and also supported by kind of you know, the mandate from German citizens, but the education sector, the amount of support that it gives to the premium car industry, that just can't be underestimated. It's hugely beneficial, you know, and you know, the top graduates from the various engineering faculties in the German universities would all basically be, you know, scooped up by the likes of Mercedes, by BMW, by Porsche, etc., and they would be competing viciously against each other to hire those people. And of course the students will be competing viciously against each other to get the best positions within those companies. Okay, so let's move on then to the third one, which is demand conditions. We can go through this one quite briefly. You know, locally, there is a very, very large internal market. It's the largest country population-wise within the EU. 80 million consumers. After German reunification, obviously became much larger. It's quite a wealthy country, and also then it has access to 420 million more in the EU common market. So those German premium cars can be sold throughout the other countries in the EU without any excessive tariffs, etc. So then we obviously have a very, you know, big cultural demand for quality. It's something that's kind of synonymous with the German consumer, that they expect quality. So they're not interested in buying kind of a bargain basement car if at all possible. And that then also lends itself to, you know, there being complete comfort amongst German consumers that they might be spending a very high percentage of their income on having a good car. And that there would be no kind of, you know, eyebrows raised about that. Whereas in other countries, you know, if you're basically, you know, let's say netting 3,000 euros a month, and you might be paying, you know, 1,500 euros a month for your rent and your utility bills, etc. But then somebody was to say, you know, well, I'm also spending 750 euros a month on having a very good quality car. You know, people would freak out and kind of go, well, that only leaves you another 750 euros a month, you know, for entertainment and for clothes, etc. You know, that mightn't be as kind of seen as peculiar in Germany. So, you know, even people who are on relatively modest incomes might be driving what we would consider a premium car. So if you were to look at certain occupations or certain income levels, and look at the type of car they're driving in Germany and contrast to other European countries, you might find that people of a similar income level are driving a more modest car. Now, that also might be affected by the fact that maybe rent and accommodation expenses are maybe less in Germany, etc. But you know, whatever the causation or the root cause behind it, the reality is that the demand conditions in the local German market amongst German consumers are very high. So if if you're Mercedes and you want to impress German consumers and convince them to buy your next model of Mercedes car, and poach them away from Audi or poach them away from BMW, or convince them to renew, you know, they already have the most recent previous version of that model, and now you're basically producing the updated one. If you want to convince them to buy that car, you're going to have to impress the hell out of them. They're not going to take any kind of poor offering. And because of that, then when you satisfy those local demand conditions, it basically puts you up at a level that when you go internationally, you just blow away the opposition. Like, you know, just consider it very simply, particularly when you consider the historical baggage. Look at how popular the German premium cars are in the United States of America. and consider, recent history, not that long ago, 1939 to 1945, well, slightly shorter time frame for the US involvement, but there's absolutely no taboo, or there's no kind of reticence on behalf of American consumers to not buy a Mercedes or buy a BMW, or buy, a Rolls Royce, which is effectively part of the German premium car industry now as well, etc. Why? Because when you contrast the standard against what the American car manufacturers are offering, there's just no comparison. And that is driven by the fact that in order for that car to pass the most basic local test back in Germany, it has to hit such a high standard, but by the time you put that in a showroom in California, the Californian consumers are just going to be blown away, and they wouldn't dream of saying, well, no, I think the Chevrolet is just as good. It's just not going to be as good. There's no way. The last one then we look at has a number of components to it. So firm structure, strategy, and rivalry. So let's look firstly at firm strategy. So the strategy, as I explained previously, in Germany has been to focus on high quality, high margin, and there's very much kind of a long-term view. The companies are viewed very much kind of as a family. I know that can kind of sometimes feel a little bit awkward and icky for some people, but there is this idea that there will be an awful lot of people, second, third generation workers within the company, and they very much, take a huge amount of pride and commitment in their work, and they believe that, they are kind of, I suppose, standing on the shoulders of giants, and what they have to do is make sure that somebody else will be able to stand on their shoulders in the future, so that, they basically have inherited a legacy, and they have a duty as a worker to ensure that there is a legacy then that is left for the next generation. And that level of commitment and that kind of, focus in terms of strategy, that has given them an advantage across all of the premium car manufacturers. The structure within the organization is very hierarchical. So again, there is, senior management make a decision, the decision is implemented, and that's it. And whether it's popular or not, it is done. And, they do have a very, very strong trade union culture, but it could be said, that it would be viewed, and certainly in contrast to many other countries, as a very mature, non-militant trade union movement. Like that when there is a downturn or a recession, the trade unions sit down and they do view it very much as not as an adversarial situation between employer and employee, but that it is a real partnership. And in a real partnership, there has to be give and take. So, you wouldn't have a situation where the head of a workers' union in BMW would go into a meeting and bang his fist on the table and say, over my dead body, there will be any compulsory redundancies. And if you try and do it, we'll go out and all-out strike and we'll bring the company to its knees. They would go in, they wouldn't be a pushover, and they would, demand, full disclosure of all the information that they need in a transparent way. And then, go back to their members, discuss it with them and say, look, what the reality is that the company does need to downsize, at least in the short term, and, it's going to have to be done. And us banging our fist on the table and threatening to go out on an all-out strike isn't going to get away from that fact. So what we're going to do here is have to try and figure out how can we put together a voluntary redundancy or a targeted redundancy package that, isn't perfect for the employer because they would like to do it completely their way. It isn't perfect for the employee because nobody wants to lose their job, but we're going to try and find some compromise. Like that's how a real partnership works. So again, that's something that has been hugely beneficial for them. And then lastly, rivalry. Well, I think that's actually pretty self-explanatory. The rivalry, again, go back to the Italian example that I mentioned earlier on. You can imagine the vicious rivalry between Versace and Gucci and Dolce & Gabbana and Armani and Pravda, etc. It's the same thing again with the German premium car companies. I can remember maybe 2 years ago, it actually been headline news in Germany that Audi had outsold BMW for the first time in its history. And that was basically what kept Audi hungry for decades. Like rather than giving up and saying, well, we're always in second place and we have to accept that, they were absolutely determined, like a dog with a bone, that they were going to definitely someday they were going to beat the local rival. They were going to show the team on the other side of the city that were better than you. And it just happened that while they were doing that, then their global sales obviously were massively increasing as well. And you even, like, let's say in the last 10 or 15 years, you'll have noticed, I'm sure, Audi cars appearing in some of the massive big, Hollywood franchises. So it wouldn't have been a big brand in the United States 10 or 15 years ago, but it is now. Why? Partly due to the incredible determination to beat the local rival. And because that local rival is such a successful international player in its own right, when you beat BMW, you're going to become that big global player too. So you think of Audi as heavily placed in the Iron Man movie franchise, the Transporter movie franchise. You're seeing it more and more. So again, that rivalry, drives an incredibly high standard. Okay, so that's the basic idea in terms of a very, very specific example, which was the German premium car industry, and why is it that Germany, that country, that region, why does it seem to offer this, national competitive advantage? Why does Germany as a nation have this competitive advantage? Or why is it that that environment is the best? Okay, so just to quickly recap, when we looked at the beginning, so again, if you wanted to fully explore this, you could go through Japan and consumer electronics. So when you think of, all of the, various consumer electronic companies in Japan, Sony, Sanyo, and Nintendo, all these ones, why is it Japan? You go through it. And I mentioned, ironically, one of the ones that has helped Japan is, factor conditions. There's a basic factor that worked against them, which is their scarcity of land or stable land, because there's a lot of seismic activity and stuff in Japan. So, that's why they have an awful lot of the miniaturization, because they need small living quarters, and they can't, have massive big stereo systems or stuff like this, etc. So that was one of the things that drove them in that regard. We take a look then at the USA, and we've kind of covered that. A big factor there is obviously the relating supporting industry. Outside of the weapons industry and outside of the military industrial complex, as it's called, another huge relating supporting industry that would be very beneficial for the United States and its domination of the IT industry is their university sector. And that's another thing that's holding China back. Like, you'll hear all this commentary all the time now that an awful lot of places in US universities are going to incredibly bright and capable Chinese students. But of course, the problem there is, why aren't those Chinese students going to a university in China? Why is it that they're felt that, if you want to be the number one, now you happen to be the number one guy in your class doing an engineering degree in the top university in China, but when it comes to doing a PhD, you're going to MIT in Boston, or you're going to Stanford, or you're going to Caltech. So that's something that the Chinese are going to have to work at, because it's another related and supporting industry that massively supports the USA's domination of that industry. We've gone through the German example, and I would suggest that that's the most obvious one. And then another one to maybe consider would be in terms of France, and France's domination of, obviously, I said before, the wine and champagne industry. You could go around it, obviously, factor, a lot of basic and advanced factors working for them. The interesting one here is look at maybe some countries that seem to be kind of catching up on them. So maybe there's some countries that have taken Porter's Diamond and said, hold on a second, we have the basic factors and the advanced factors as well. Now, we mightn't have the other stuff, but let's work on that. One that I think is quite almost funny in a way, particularly when you think of geography, is think of in Ireland and the UK how much Australian wine we consume. Now, having said that, not much of it is at the premium level. So France is still maybe very much dominating the premium wine industry, but there is an awful lot of, what you would call, standard wine producers in France, and, they're being hugely challenged by Australia, which you would imagine is at a massive, almost basic factor disadvantage, because they do have the sunshine, they do have the soil, but they don't necessarily have the rainfall that they have in France. It's a little bit too hot and arid maybe sometimes in Australia. And secondly then, the distance. Look at how far the wine has to travel from Australia to many of its markets, in contrast to the short distance that the French wine has to travel. But If you go around the rest of the diamond, you might, say, well, I can see why the Australians are putting the French under a bit of pressure here, because if you look at the related supporting industries, what they're doing in their university courses, they actually have dedicated degrees in their agricultural colleges now, rather than dealing with the good old reliables in Australia, very much to do with the sheep industry, etc., and high quality wool for companies like UGG. We all know the famous UGG boot. They have focused on this. They've also, massively tried to convince Australian consumers, particularly Australian male consumers, that, you don't have to drink beer. Drinking wine is perfectly okay. There's kind of a machismo culture in Australia, hardy guys all into sport and wrestling alligators, or sorry, no alligators in Australia, wrestling crocodiles, etc. This kind of silly stereotype, but some people kind of felt that they had to kind of conform to that stereotype. So what they've tried to do is, generate a discerning local customer base, that you actually have many people who would consider themselves kind of wine buffs in Australia. That drives very high standards, and then when that Australian wine competes in an international market, suddenly people, if they did a blind taste test and they're given a couple of different glasses, you might find that, they say, well, yeah, I thought the best glasses here were glass 1, glass 3 and glass 5. Wasn't too impressed with glass 2 and glass 4. And it might turn out that 1, 3 and 5 are Australian and glass 2 and 4 are French, and they're at the same price point. So, it's an interesting one, where France, certainly does or did have a huge national competitive advantage and have an environment that seemed to give it a real leg up. That doesn't necessarily last forever. Okay, so how might this be asked in the exam? Let's imagine that you understand the theory. All right, so the two most likely scenarios are, and this is the one that's been asked most frequently. So a company based in country A, region A, is considering a move to country or region B, and then using Porters Diamond, you must assess if country or region B has an NCA, has a national competitive advantage, or offers a better environment. So like I said at the beginning, you're basically in country A. There's a valley between you and country B. Should we move across the valley? Should we go basically over to the other side? Does that give us a better shot at being successful? So that will benefit the company in contrast to its current location. Or the other one, which hasn't really been asked yet, but it might be because there's been 3 past papers at this stage, so maybe he will kind of change it up a little bit the next time it's asked, is, so a company in the case might be relatively successful or unsuccessful. So you might be kind of asked to kind of initially, just analyze the company's current position using a combination of the other models, SWOT, PESTEL, 5 forces, etc. But then you might be asked to use Porters Diamond to give a little bit more insight, because maybe the reason that the company is successful is not really down to them. It's not that they're any great shakes. It's they happen to be kind of blessed or fortunate that they're in this country that provides this incredibly fertile environment or gives them a national competitive advantage. Or, in contrast, it might be the reason the company isn't very successful, is actually relatively unsuccessful, is not because they're a poor company and that they're dysfunctional. It could be that they've been dealt a bad hand. Unfortunately, circumstance has dictated that they're located in this particular country or region, and that's just not the best environment for you to thrive and prosper. So it could be kind of part of a more insightful analysis to say, look, in terms of this company's success, yeah, they are successful, but let's be clear about it here now. Reality check. It's not all down to them. It's very much like a kind of a fortunate thing for them that they were, excuse the expression, that they were born in that country. Or they're not very successful, but that's not because they're a terribly mismanaged company with a whole load of weaknesses. It's because it's very difficult for them to thrive and prosper in that environment. They basically were kind of given a bad hand to start with. Okay, so just for completeness then, there is some additional material in my course notes. If you take a look from page 281 to 284, you'll see this document from Michael Porter, believe it or not. He came over to Ireland in 2003 as a guest of the Irish Management Institute, and part of his presentation was actually Porters Diamond. So on 280, you can actually see this is a slide from his presentation explaining what the constituent parts are. And what he did here on the next one, you can see on page 282, was he basically said, look, here's how I would assess the Irish business environment from a positive perspective. You might notice there that he maybe correctly identified, certainly back in 2003. Now, that's a long time ago, to be fair. I think Ireland has developed. We weren't necessarily the most demanding consumers. You know, the Irish stereotype of you get a lousy meal in a restaurant and the waiting staff comes over to you and asks, is everything okay? And even though it's not, you kind of go, oh yeah, it's lovely. Don't make a scene, etc. So you can see that like he didn't have much positive things to say about our demand conditions. Then on the last page of this presentation, you see on 284, all right, he basically said, look, this is where you maybe need to improve. This was a good 5 years before our recession. And unfortunately, it would appear that, nice presentation and high profile speaker and great PR at the time, but I don't think it made it into the kind of the corridors of power. And I'm not sure if much of it was kind of taken on board. So that's a bit of a pity. So look, it's just some extra reading for you if you get an opportunity, or heaven forbid that you might actually find it interesting, which I do. I find Porter's Diamond to be one of the more interesting models. Personally, I think it's a pity it's not asked more, but that's just the way it goes. Okay, so look, the 3 past paper questions so far, we can see there, June 10, question 2B, a 10 marker, December 13, question 1C, a 10 marker. So, that's where, knowing nothing about Porter's Diamond in that exam was going to cost you big time. And then most recently, June 2016, question 4A. Now, it wasn't published, so we don't even know how many marks were available for it. But again, it would have to be kind of, divisible by 4 or divisible by 5, depending on how you look at it. If you split factor conditions into 2, there's 5 elements. So, I'm guessing it was maybe, let's say, a 10 marker, a 12 marker, maybe a 16 marker, as much as that, and that kind of an idea. So very briefly, let's look at them. This is the one from June 10, question 2B. Examine using Porter's Diamond or an appropriate alternative model or framework the factors which would influence Swift's decision to move a large part of the logistics base to Acuria. So like I've mentioned a couple of times at this stage, the straightforward situation, we're in country A on one side of the valley, over there is country B on the other side. Should we move? Should we hop across the valley? In this case, the other side of the valley is this country called Acuria. Now, one thing I want to mention here, which is quite important, is if you look at this question in its entirety, we're focusing obviously on the Porter's Diamond part, which was 10 marks. And some people might say, well, look, what I would do in the exam if that happened is, because I haven't got time to be studying all these peripheral topics, is I just wouldn't do that question. And, I can understand that many people would have taken that view. But the unrelated part here is the reason why you should have known something about Porter's Diamond. Now, I know that sounds a little bit weird, but think of it this way. So, the reason that you should have known something about Porter's Diamond and at least be able to attempt the 10 marker here is not with the hope of scoring highly on the 10 marker. It's with the hope that you could have scored enough on the 10 marker to give you permission to do the 15 marker. Okay, so let's just explore that a bit more. So if you look at the part A here, you are asked to assess using both financial and non-financial measures the attractiveness from Swiss perspective of EVM as an acquisition target. Now that's an absolute beauty of a question, and any ACCA student stereotypically would love to do that question. But you also would have to accept the fact that you're not necessarily going to automatically get 12.5 out of 15, and therefore you can afford to get 0 for part B. That's just not realistic. So what we have to consider here is, when we look at it, the piece of advice that I've outlined previously in the hints, and it's on page 200 of your course notes. So adequate preparation may not mean that you've covered 100% of the course 100% proficiency. Indeed, it may be better to have covered 60% of the course 100% proficiency and know something about the remaining 40%. And that's very important. So nobody is saying that you should attempt that question B and be going into it like, hoping to be scoring 6 or 7 out of 10. Because it's just not possible with the breadth of the syllabus. Now, if you had all the time in the world, of course you could study Porter's Diamond to the same level that you'd study Porter's 5 Forces. But most people can't do that. So you study Porter's 5 Forces with a little bit more emphasis, because that's more likely to come up, and when it does, it's for higher marks. But you can't then adopt the approach that you're going to not study Porter's Diamond at all. Because if you do, it denies you the opportunity to do a question like this, the part A. If you can't get some marks for the part B, you're probably going to have to avoid this question entirely. And that's a very high price to pay. So if we just take a look here, if you look at the narrative of this question, I'm referring now to the part A, you'll see here that it says the company is perceived as a good performer in its sector. Now what they mean by that is the company they're talking about there is Swift, and they're saying, look, Swift is a good performer, so it sets the benchmark. And, you know, it sets a benchmark in the following areas. So it basically gives you these 7 financial ratios that any P3 student worth their salt would do standing on their head. It talks about ROCE, gross profit margin, net profit margin, current liquidity ratio, asset test ratio, gearing, and interest cover. And if you basically are comfortable and can calculate those then for the acquisition target, which is EVM, which is basically in the narrative, and what you're given is the financials for EVM, you now have got basically 7 marks worth of the answer to part A. Because one of the ways you're going to figure out if Swift is an attractive, if EVM is an attractive acquisition target for Swift is take Swift's performance in those areas and use those to benchmark against EVM's performance in those areas. So in other words, work out those ratios for EVM and then compare and contrast. So again, if that's 7 of the 15 marks for part A, can you imagine how easy it might be to get maybe 8, 9, 10? But if you only got 10 out of 15, you failed the question. So the problem with that is that you have a bit of an issue in that regard. So what you have to try and do is make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, so that hopefully emphasizes the importance of you, again, that thing that I keep repeating, you know, it's important for you to know 60% of the course to 100% proficiency, but know something about the other 40%, because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where, because of the fact that you couldn't make any reasonable attempt at part B, it denies you the opportunity of really making a kind of an attempt at part A. And, you know, again, hopefully what would happen is a student might get, you know, 10 or 11 or maybe even 12 out of 15 for part A. But then nobody would give out to you for only, if I can use that term, and I don't mean that, you know, but only scoring 4 out of 10 for part B. You know, if you got that, like, that's a really, really solid score out of 25 overall. But, you know, it's just something to consider if at all possible. You know, don't spend too much time into peripheral topics, but, you know, don't basically disregard them totally at the same time. Okay, the other question, very straightforward as well, same type of an idea. Porters Diamond was explicitly stated, and then again, relative attractiveness. So again, Sealand, you know, country A, the valley, on the other side, Aboria, country B. You know, does Aboria offer a better environment? That's the basic idea. So, you know, no real mystery in that context. Okay, the most recent one then unfortunately was not published. Now I'm not even going to get started on that. I have very strong views about the ACCA's recent decision to not publish all of the past papers. Here's really not the forum for that. But what we did get was some information in the examiner's report, and let's just quickly look at that. So again, it required the application of Porters Diamond. Majority of candidates answered very well this part of the question with a good recognition of how the facts provided in the scenario fit into the various elements of the model. Now, that would suggest to a large extent that what's going to happen is that the examining team take the view that this is now a topic that's well established, because of the fact that there's a number of past paper questions out there, that it has kind of raised their expectation, and effectively it kind of has become a more normalized topic. So you'd want to be conscious about that, and I wouldn't be at all surprised that when Porters Diamond appears again in an exam question, it'll land right back into question 1, and feel that, you know, and it might even increase the marks a small bit, might, you know, elevate it up from a 10 marker to a little bit higher. Now, if you just look at the portion here, where students didn't perform well, he says, however, many missed out on higher marks by failing to evaluate the information provided in the scenario with regards to whether this enhanced the company's chances of success in this venture. So again, same type of an idea, all right? The company, which has its own strengths and weaknesses, its own internal situation, if that company was to basically somehow, you know, lift itself and all of its nuts and bolts and go from position or environment or country or region A and go over to B, would that then elevate its chances? And you might have a situation where, there might be some trade-off. There are certain, elements of Porter's Diamond that mightn't be as positive in the second location. They might lose out on certain things, but that might be more than compensated for the things that they gain. So the idea here is that, whereas, some people were obviously able to answer the first part of the question here, to apply it, and I'm suspecting what they meant by that is that you had to kind of nearly explain it in a way. Where people maybe fell down here was on the second part is, would there be of any benefit to the organization if it was to do this, from a Porter's Diamond perspective. Okay, so we're almost finished now. Last thing is, obviously we will be doing a question on Porter's Diamond on the revision course. My idea behind this is that it will be one of the peripheral topics, therefore that you will have to spend none of your personal private revision time on between now and the exam. And this is a preview of the question we'll be doing. And if you just take a quick look at this, hopefully if any of the presentation has been making sense up until now, this shouldn't be double Dutch. When you look at this, you say, look, yeah, I'm looking at some of that stuff there. Very discerning customers. They have some of the harshest weather in Europe. They have second or third generation workers. A college in the region runs a special craft workers course, which is heavily subsidized by the government. Local farmers in another industry, the sheep farming industry, you can see it there, have changed our farming methods to focus on the quality of the wool rather than meat. The government then is doing more stuff and providing grants and other assistance. So if you look at those items, hopefully at this stage, and you haven't had a chance now to fully absorb everything, some of that stuff now you should be able to map back to the model. And you should be able to say, well, look, yeah, I think what's written down there is, yeah, discerning customers, very discerning customers. That looks like local demand conditions. And then what about that bad weather? The bad weather? Well, that's something, that's God-given. Your climate is a kind of a thing that, is either there or not there. Now, in this case, it's harsh weather, but that has driven their standards. That has kind of forced them to be the best. So that is a basic factor condition. Then you obviously look at a college. So there's a college that runs a course that is specifically aimed at providing highly skilled employees for your company. Well, a college, certainly isn't the same industry as us, but it's another industry and it's supporting us. So, there's an example of. So again, once you've got your theory, and you see the narrative, then it should be easy or relatively easy for you to map the theory against the specifics of a case study. So we will be doing this obviously on the revision course. Okay, so that's basically it. That concludes the presentation. I know it has been maybe a little bit longer than people would like, but it is a peripheral model. It's not maybe an easy one to absorb. It's not like, explaining SWOT or the Boston Consulting Group matrix or the cultural web. It is a little bit more nuanced. I know it is a peripheral topic, but as I've explained, particularly on that occasion that it was asked in question 1, you would have paid a very heavy penalty for not being able to do anything on it. And then most recently, or prior to that, we saw the one where it wasn't so much the Porter's Diamond question that was the penalty. It was the inability for you to do the part A. Because if you knew nothing about Porter's Diamond, you probably had to avoid that question. So there is a very, very real and significant incentive for you to ensure that you're able to do this properly. So that concludes it. I hope you found it useful.